Imagine for a moment that some of the most profound words ever spoken by Jesus were hidden, buried, and forbidden for centuries, not because they lacked truth, but because their truth was too powerful. What if I told you that the early church feared not the heretics, but the awakening of the individual soul? That one secret text, the Book of James, also known as the Apocryphon of James, was silenced because it dared to reveal the greatest secret of all, that the divine spark lies not in temples or institutions, but within you. Think about it. Why would any church, supposedly founded on truth, suppress the very teachings of its master? Why would the Vatican, the guardian of sacred knowledge, choose to hide certain scriptures from humanity? Could it be that these texts, rather than threatening faith, threatened control? Today we will uncover the story of a hidden gospel, one that carries messages so radical, so transformative, that they could have changed the very foundation of Christianity as we know it. And the most shocking revelation of all, the one at the end, might just change how you understand the words of Jesus forever. Before we continue, if you're someone who seeks truth beyond dogma, if you've ever felt there's more to spirituality than what organized religion allows you to see, then make sure to subscribe to this channel, leave your like, share this video, and let your thoughts flow in the comments. Because what we're about to uncover will not only challenge the official history, it will awaken something ancient within you. The final revelation we'll reach by the end of this video is the most powerful of all. The Book of James was discovered in Egypt in 1945 as part of the famous Nag Hammadi library, a collection of texts buried for nearly 2,000 years. These writings belong to early Christian mystics, often labeled by the church as Gnostics. But Gnostic simply means one who knows, one who seeks direct experience of the divine rather than blind obedience to authority. These were not rebels against Christ, but seekers of the same truth he embodied. Yet their voices were silenced, their texts burned, their followers branded as heretics. And among those forbidden writings was this mysterious Book of James. In this text, James, known as the brother of Jesus, receives secret teachings directly from the risen Christ. But what makes it so controversial is not merely what Jesus says, but what he asks. He doesn't command submission, he calls for awakening. He tells his disciples not to wait for salvation from above, but to become the living embodiment of truth. The Jesus of the Book of James is not a distant savior. He is a teacher of inner resurrection, guiding humanity towards self-knowledge and spiritual freedom. This message struck at the heart of institutional religion. If the divine is within you, then no priest, no bishop, no structure has power over your soul. And that was the most dangerous idea of all. Let us pause here and reflect. What would happen if every believer realized that heaven is not a place we go to, but a state we awaken within ourselves? How would history have unfolded if the church had embraced this radical understanding instead of burying it beneath centuries of doctrine? Would humanity have evolved faster, spiritually, morally, and consciously? Historians like Elaine Pagels, a scholar from Princeton University and author of the Gnostic Gospels, argue that the suppression of these texts was not about protecting faith, but about consolidating authority. She notes that early Christianity was incredibly diverse, filled with mystical traditions, teachers, and interpretations. But as the church grew in power, it needed unity, structure, and control. The mystical path that emphasized direct experience of God was seen as a threat. So, it was erased. But why among so many lost gospels does the Book of James stand out? Because it dares to portray Jesus as a teacher of hidden wisdom, someone who speaks not in parables for the masses, but in pure truth for the awakened. In it, Jesus tells James that the material world is fleeting, that those who seek eternal life must transcend illusion, and that salvation lies in knowledge, not belief. This was not a message meant to control, it was a message meant to liberate. And perhaps that is why the Vatican has long avoided recognizing this gospel. Its message threatens not just dogma, but the very hierarchy that claims to speak in God's name. The Church fears not the words of Christ, but the power of those who understand them. So as we journey deeper into this forgotten gospel, we must ask ourselves, what is truth? Is it what is written in canonized scriptures, or what is whispered in the silence of our own consciousness? The Book of James calls us to seek, to question, and to awaken. And as we continue, we will uncover the exact words Jesus spoke in secret, the teachings that could have transformed Christianity into a path of spiritual freedom rather than obedience. Because what Jesus revealed to James was not meant for the few, it was meant for all who are ready to awaken. The book of James begins with a mysterious scene. The disciples are gathered together, still struggling to understand the meaning of the crucifixion and resurrection. Suddenly, the risen Jesus appears before them, not as a distant figure of worship, but as a radiant teacher of wisdom. His message is urgent, profound, and unlike anything found in the official Gospels. He tells them, "Do not be deceived by those who rule the world, nor by those who rule over you." These words alone carried a revolutionary tone, for they challenged the very foundations of earthly authority, political, religious, and spiritual. Think carefully about what that means. Jesus was not simply preaching moral behavior, he was pointing toward liberation from illusion. He wanted his followers to see through the veil of control, whether imposed by kings, priests, or systems of belief. He told them to awaken, to become full of light, so that darkness could no longer enslave them. In a world built on hierarchy, fear, and obedience, this was a call to inner freedom that could not be tolerated by those who sought to rule in his name. Scholars like Marvin Meyer and Bart Ehrman have noted that this text reveals a very different side of early Christianity, one centered not on sin and punishment, but on enlightenment and awakening. Jesus here speaks as a guide who reminds humanity that the path to the divine does not lie outside of oneself. He tells James, "Become better than I, become like me." It is as if he is saying, "Do not worship me, become what I am." This was the most radical message imaginable, one that turned followers into equals, servants into sons, and believers into co-creators of divine truth. Now imagine how this message would have sounded to the early church fathers, who were struggling to unify doctrine and authority. How could they maintain control over a population that believed salvation came not from the church, but from within their own consciousness? The answer was simple: they could not. And so, these writings were declared heresy, hidden away and condemned to oblivion. But the truth cannot be buried forever. The sands of Egypt preserved what fire and decree tried to destroy. The book of James also reveals a profound teaching about suffering and transformation. Jesus tells James that those who seek truth must pass through trials, not as punishment, but as initiation. He says, "Become full of love, do not be afraid of the flesh, nor of those who kill it." This echoes his words in the canonical Gospels, yet here the meaning is deeper. The true resurrection happens within, through self-knowledge and fearlessness. The body may perish, but the awakened soul transcends all boundaries. Think about this in your own life. How many times have you faced trials that seemed unbearable, only to realize later that they led to growth and awareness? Could it be that what we call suffering is in truth the alchemy of the soul? This hidden gospel suggests exactly that pain, doubt, and loss are not curses, but sacred opportunities to awaken the divine spark within us. And perhaps this is where the danger lies. A human being who understands that they carry within them the essence of God becomes impossible to manipulate. They do not need intermediaries to reach the divine. They need only silence, reflection, and courage. Jesus tells his disciples that the Father is not a distant being watching from the heavens, but the living presence that breathes through all creation. To recognize that presence within oneself is to discover the kingdom of heaven, here, now, in this very moment. Ask yourself this: what if the greatest lie ever told was that you are separate from God, that you must obey, conform, and submit to reach the light, when in truth, the light has always been within you? The book of James reminds us that awakening is not rebellion against God. It is the realization that you have never been apart from him. At this point, the text becomes even more mysterious. Jesus warns his disciples that false teachers will arise, twisting his message for power. He says that those who understand his words must guard them carefully, not because they are secrets meant to exclude others, but because humanity was not yet ready for them. He tells James, "You have heard and understood. You shall be called the one who is awake." This single line carries an echo of every mystical tradition across time, from the awakened Buddha in the East to the illuminated adept in the Hermetic schools of Alexandria. What is awakening then? It is the moment when you realize that heaven and earth are not two realms, but one continuous field of consciousness. It is the moment when you no longer seek God outside yourself, but discover him in the stillness of your own being. And this realization, this sacred inner knowing, is precisely what the institutions of power fear most. Let us not forget that this gospel was written in the same period when the Roman Empire and the emerging church began to merge political and spiritual authority. The Council of Nicaea, centuries later, would formalize which teachings were divine and which were heretical. Those who dared to speak of direct union with the divine, without priest or temple, were branded as enemies. The Book of James was not merely suppressed, it was erased from memory, sealed behind the walls of forbidden archives. But today, as these texts resurface, we are invited once again to hear the unfiltered words of Jesus, the ones that call not for obedience, but for transformation. And as we will see in the next part, the most dangerous words he ever spoke were not against Rome or the Church, but against the illusion that humanity is powerless. Because in the hidden verses of this gospel, Jesus reveals the secret of immortality, not as life without death, but as consciousness beyond decay. In the hidden passages of the book of James, we find a dialogue unlike anything in the canonical scriptures. Jesus looks into the eyes of his disciples and says, "Remember what I have told you. The kingdom is not in the sky, and it is not in the sea, but within you and all around you." These words echo across centuries, calling out to anyone who dares to listen beyond the surface of religion. They are the most dangerous words ever spoken because they strip away the need for intermediaries and reveal the sacred truth of human divinity. Imagine the weight of those words in a world where faith was controlled by priests and empires. To say that the kingdom of God exists within each person was to declare spiritual independence, to proclaim that no church, no hierarchy, no power could separate you from the divine source. It was not rebellion against God, it was rebellion against those who claimed to own him. The Jesus who speaks in the book of James is not the passive figure of conventional faith. He is a luminous being of wisdom, urging his followers to see themselves as co-creators of reality. He tells them, "Become seekers until you find. When you find, you will be troubled. When you are troubled, you will marvel and reign over all." This is the language of initiation. It describes the mystical journey of the soul, from ignorance to questioning, from confusion to awakening, and finally to enlightenment. Let us pause and ask, why would such words be considered dangerous? Because they remove fear. A person who no longer fears hell, punishment, or divine wrath cannot be enslaved by guilt. They live from love, from awareness, from truth. Such a person is not easy to govern or manipulate. The institutions built upon fear lose their power the moment one soul awakens to its own light. This idea of inner awakening runs parallel to the Hermetic wisdom of ancient Egypt, where seekers were taught that as above, so below, as within, so without. It also mirrors the words of Plato, who spoke of remembering divine knowledge through the act of self-discovery. The book of James fits perfectly into this ancient lineage of enlightenment, a tradition where the divine spark within each person is the path to salvation. The Church, however, could not allow this. To preserve its authority, it built a theology of dependency. Instead of teaching people to awaken, it taught them to wait, to believe, obey, and hope for salvation after death. The mystic path was replaced with ritual. The temple of the heart was replaced with stone cathedrals. Yet beneath all of this, the forbidden words of Jesus survived like embers beneath the ashes, waiting for the wind of truth to reignite them. The text continues with an astonishing exchange. James asks Jesus why he speaks in riddles, and Jesus replies, "Because the heart of this people has grown dull. They have closed their eyes so that they do not see." It is as if he foresaw that his message would be misunderstood, even by those who loved him. He warns them that the world will reject truth, because truth demands transformation. To awaken is to die to illusion, and humanity, afraid of losing its comfort, clings to falsehood. Think about this in your own life. How often do we avoid truth because it threatens our sense of control or security? How many times do we silence our inner voice because it calls us toward change? The same struggle that faced the disciples 2,000 years ago still lives within us today. The book of James reminds us that awakening is not an abstract idea. It is a living process that begins the moment we dare to see. In one of the most profound sections, Jesus tells James that true life is born from understanding the nature of death. He says, "Those who know themselves will not taste death." This statement has been interpreted in many ways. Some take it literally, others see it as symbolic. But the essence is clear. Immortality is not the continuation of the body, it is the awakening of the eternal consciousness within. When you realize that you are not the body, not the mind, but the awareness behind them, death loses its power over you. This teaching, once again, mirrors ancient initiatory traditions. In the mysteries of Eleusis, in Egypt, and later in Hermetic philosophy, initiates were symbolically buried and resurrected to signify the death of ignorance and the birth of illumination. The Book of James carries the same current of wisdom. Jesus is not promising paradise in another world. He is offering transformation in this one. Yet it is easy to understand why these words were feared. A human being who no longer fears death, who no longer sees separation between God and self, becomes uncontrollable. They see through the illusions of power, money, and authority. They live from the center of divine consciousness itself. That, to the empire and to the church, was the most dangerous person of all. Modern scholars like Jean-Yves Leloup and Bentley Layton have emphasized that the Apocryphon of James represents a bridge between Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, and early Christian spirituality. It is a map of transformation, showing how divine awareness can awaken within the human being. And that map was locked away because it made every human soul a potential Christ. Ask yourself this: what would the world look like if every person understood this? If children were taught not to fear God, but to discover Him within? If prayer was not pleading for help, but communion with the infinite presence that breathes within all things? Would we still have wars, divisions, and hatred done in the name of religion? The answers lie hidden in the same secret the Vatican once tried to erase, that Jesus' ultimate teaching was not submission, but realization. And as we move into the final part of this journey, we will uncover the most forbidden revelation of all, the message that not only redefines who Jesus was, but who you truly are. Because the real danger of the Book of James was never in its words. The danger was in what would happen if humanity ever truly understood them. The final revelation within the Book of James comes as Jesus prepares to depart once more from his disciples. His voice, filled with compassion yet urgency, carries a message that pierces through time itself. He tells them, "You have heard the truth. Keep it within you. Do not build temples for me, for what you build will fall. Instead, raise up the temple of your heart, for there I dwell." Those words alone hold the essence of why this gospel was banned. The entire structure of organized religion, its cathedrals, its rituals, its hierarchy, depends on the idea that God lives elsewhere. But Jesus, in this hidden gospel, declares that the only true sanctuary is within. When he says, "Raise up the temple of your heart," he is pointing to the divine presence that exists not in any church, but in the awakened soul. Now pause and think about that. For centuries, humanity has been taught to look upward, to pray to a distant heaven, to seek salvation through external authority. But what if Jesus' real message was that the kingdom is not to be reached but remembered? What if the divine is not something we must earn, but something we already are? This realization is the key that opens the gates of spiritual freedom, and it is precisely this key that the Vatican chose to hide. As the scene unfolds, James falls to his knees, overwhelmed by what he has heard. Jesus tells him, "Be strong within, for those who awaken will be opposed. You will be hated for revealing what is hidden, but blessed are those who endure." These words are prophetic. They echo through history, reflecting the countless seekers, mystics, and visionaries who were persecuted for carrying the same flame of truth. From the Gnostics of Alexandria to the mystics of medieval Europe, from Giordano Bruno to Meister Eckhart, the story repeats. Those who teach that God is within are silenced by those who profit from keeping him distant. And yet the light always returns. No matter how many scrolls are burned or forbidden, no matter how many voices are silenced, the truth re-emerges. Because truth does not belong to any religion, it belongs to consciousness itself. The Book of James survived not because it was preserved by power, but because it was preserved by spirit. It waited patiently, hidden in the desert sands, for the day when humanity would be ready once again to hear. Ask yourself now, are we ready? Are we ready to accept a vision of Jesus not as a figure of submission, but as a teacher of liberation? Can we understand that the Christ he spoke of was not limited to his own person, but is a living presence awakening in all of humanity? The danger of this gospel is not that it denies Jesus, but that it reveals we are meant to become like him, not through imitation, but through realization. This is the ultimate heresy, the one truth that unravels the chains of fear, that each of us is a child of the same divine source, capable of awakening the same light, living the same truth, and manifesting the same love. When Jesus tells James, "Become better than I, become like me," he is not expressing arrogance. He is passing the torch of enlightenment. He is saying that the mission of the Christ was never to be worshipped. It was to be continued. Modern theologians who have studied the Gnostic scriptures, such as Elaine Pagel's Karen King and Bentley Layton, agree that these texts present Jesus as a revealer of divine consciousness, not a ruler demanding obedience, but a mirror showing us what we truly are. The suppression of such teachings was not accidental. It was strategic. To control people, one must make them believe they are powerless. To free them, one must remind them of their inner divinity. The book of James does exactly that. So what is the most dangerous message of Jesus that the Vatican tried to bury? It is this: you and the Father are one, that the light he carried burns equally within all, that no church, no authority, no dogma can stand between you and the divine source that created you, that heaven is not a reward for obedience, but the natural state of an awakened soul. When this truth is understood, everything changes. The wars fought in God's name lose their justification. The fear of death dissolves. The need for control collapses. Humanity stands not as sinners begging for mercy, but as conscious beings capable of love, wisdom, and creation. This is the gospel that could have transformed the world, and that is precisely why it was silenced. But now, centuries later, it has returned, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. It reflects to us what religion has forgotten, that spirituality is not about separation, it is about unity. The divine is not beyond reach, it is breathing through every heartbeat, shining through every act of compassion, whispering through every moment of awareness. So as we close this journey, remember the promise given to James: "Blessed are those who awaken, for they have already entered the kingdom." Those words were never meant for one disciple. They were meant for all who are ready to see. If these teachings resonate with you, if you feel that spark of recognition deep within your being, then perhaps you have already begun to awaken. Because the true gospel of Jesus was never about belief. It was about remembrance, and the time has come for humanity to remember. The hidden book has spoken again. Its message was forbidden, not because it was false, but because it was true. And now that truth is in your hands. What you do with it, that is the real revelation. Thanks for looking.